Well, let's bring on Sister Elaine Brown to take us further into our program.
Well, we used to always say back in the days of the Black Panther Party, I say today, all power to the people. And that means two things, that you have the power and you have the right to have all the power together. And that's why we've come together today. I'm going to speak very briefly about two issues concerning the question of incarceration. One of them is how so many people got into prison in this country over the last 20 years. The prison population from 1994 to 2004 doubled, and that is because of Bill Clinton, whose wife is now trying to run for president. That's what she is, his wife, you know. So he pushed through a piece of legislation to the federal government called the Amendment to the Omnibus Crime Bill, which immediately was picked up first by Pete Wilson here in California, who was one of the biggest advocates for it. And at that time, it was generally called after that, as Minister Christopher pointed out, it was called the Three Strikes Crime Legislation. And since 1994 to today, although there's been one slight amendment, some minor variation on who can go to prison, we're talking about incarcerating people after 2 felonies and putting them in prison for life. But that isn't the worst part of 3 strikes. 3 strikes had mandatory sentencing, and we all know that some of that sentencing went to the poor who were on the streets selling the crack that the CIA dumped into our communities. And so they went to prison for 5 years, where somebody with, for one crack rock selling it, and where somebody who had powder cocaine and, you know, a pound of it would go to prison for like a year in the county jail. So that lasted. So we have a lot of black men and women and Latinos in prison for these so-called street crimes under the same 3 strikes crime program. So nothing has been done to amend or reform that legislation. The other part of that is it broke down the entire juvenile justice system and allowed the states to try children. State of California, a child of 14 years old can be tried as an adult, go to an adult facility. We're not even going to talk about the racial disparities and how that is meted out, but the bottom line, if you're 14 years old and you are charged with certain crimes, you can go to prison, an adult prison, for the rest of your life, even if it is considered with a life with parole. It is very doubtful that you will get parole under the 3 strikes crime legislation. We have to understand this because it was Bill Clinton who created this legislation. And what are our black elected officials and Latino elected officials doing to repeal this? Absolutely nothing. We have to call on the Tony Thurmans of the world and the Rob Bontas of the world out of the East Bay, people of color, and say, why haven't you introduced legislation to repeal these laws when you know they affect black and brown people more than anyone else? And how do we know that? We just look at the numbers. And the state of California has the biggest prison system in America, which has the biggest prison system in the world. This is the only country that puts children and tries children as adults and puts them into prison with adults. This is the only country that does that. And if we don't see that, and we're not angry about thinking that any child here 14 or over can be arbitrarily charged with a crime and go to prison for life, then we're playing games. And we haven't said a word about 3 strikes. We somehow feel we can fix it and have the sentences a little less. What are we talking about? The whole thing has to go down and go back to some sort of justice system. And if we're not going to call for that justice, and we're not going to deliver a consequence when it doesn't come, then we'll just be out here every year and every month rallying and crying and whining about the different issues that are going on. So I don't think we're a bunch of whiners and criers, are we? I think we need to take some action and demand that these legislators, at least some of those that represent these communities that have high populations of people inside the prisons because of the 3 strikes crime legislation, and demand that they introduce bills to halt and repeal that horrible law and all that horrible sentencing of life without parole, life with very minor. You can get a life sentence without parole without having killed anyone. And we need to know that. We're not reading and we're not learning and we're not getting angry enough. So I've said enough, but that's one of the big issues we need to ask for. Repeal the 3 strikes crime laws, period. No more mending, fixing, let's tweak this and tweak that. No, that's what's happened for 20 years now, and we have been all right with it. We have been all right with it, and now we have a population in prison. There's no even place to put any more prisoners in California, which is why Jerry Brown was forced by the U.S. Supreme Court, thanks to the order of Judge Stelton Henderson, a black man here in California. He was finally forced. Arnold Schwarzenegger wouldn't do it, and Jerry Brown finally was forced by the Supreme Court to begin to empty out these prisons, and now they've been shifting a lot of people into the county jail, so that's another conversation. So I want us to remember, we want justice. We want justice. Okay, I'm going to introduce my brother, my comrade, Brother Jerry Elster, who is, he can tell you something about himself and why he's fighting so hard for prison reform. He is a board member of a nonprofit that we have together called Oakland and the World Enterprises, the purpose of which is to develop businesses for people coming out to joint, or formerly incarcerated if you like, and to develop for-profit business so they can have a pathway for economic justice without having to resort to the underground economy that so many of us resort to. We just didn't get caught. So, you know, that's a big difference between I could have been your cellmate kind of thing. You know, let's not get it twisted about people that went to prison. Most of them are the ones that got caught, and some of the rest of us just didn't get caught. Don't sit out there and act like you don't know what I'm talking about. So anyway, I would like to introduce him, and he's also a member of the organization All of Us or None. And so this is my brother, my comrade, Jerry Elster.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I'm supposed to talk about prison reform. I think to put the two words in the same sentence is an oxymoron. But if we must, let's talk about some of the things. See, we've been forever trying to get a system that knows quite well what is done to understand what they're doing to us. I don't think it's our job to really keep telling them what they're doing to us, but start demanding justice. In the streets, when you hear the brothers saying, I'm not going to use the profanity up here, and the sisters saying in the street, F the police. They're saying justice. See, but we got to make that or else become operative. We got to put application behind that. See, too long or else has been picking up mine and going to get mine and forgetting about yours. We got to learn to start moving across this country together. You heard the brother talk about us being a voice for California right here today, which expands to us being a voice for the nation, right? If we don't speak up, who will? Nobody. If we don't stand up, who will? You know, so we need to step up and seek justice or else. Now let's talk about this prison reform. First of all, like Elaine touched on, she talked about the 3 strikes, and the brother talked about the 3 strikes. My name is Jerry Elster. I've been out now going on 6 years. Just got off a lifetime parole last year. I spent 26 years inside those dungeons called Department of Corrections. I seen their idea of what correction was. It took me at least 5 to 6 years to realize what their idea of correction and rehabilitation was, and what mine was in contrary conflict with one another. So I started educating myself. The reason I speak so loudly about self-accountability, and I speak that in initial stages rather than the latter, because I think that until we stand up as individuals and take accountability for ourselves, we can't expect anybody else to do it for us. And I think a lot of times when we talk about this justice reform thing, justice must also start with us. We must remember that a system, when they talk about justice, their justice is not to just us for just us. You feel me? And we got to remember that. We have to be the ones on the front line. We have to be the ones in those think tanks when you're talking about decisions that's about us, right? 3 strikes. Elaine told you where that came from. How many of y'all know about AB 109? Realignment. Realignment was something they came with. Well, I'm not going to even give it, it doesn't even deserve to me the full time of me explaining everything about it. But I will say simple, AB 109 was realignment, where the state, Jerry Brown was forced to release some prisoners because the taxpayers, they couldn't milk the taxpayers no more. They made it look like some noble thing that they decided to just allow those who were non-violent, non-sexual, non-serious felons, as they called them, they were going to send them back down to the county jail. This was done after almost a 20-year hiatus, right, of not any kind of change, nothing but aggravating sentences and those who were being put in those prisons. We went from having like 30,000 in California to within 10 years having 170,000 prisoners in California. We went from having, and this was all in the 80s, up into the 90s. We went from having 13 prisons across California to now we have 33 prisons across California. And who's being housed in those prisons? Who's being housed in those prisons? Okay, so when you talk about justice or us, we got to quit looking for reforms from our state legislators and sit back in our living room and expect them to do the right thing. We got to be in these offices demanding that they do the right thing. So when we say justice or else, justice has to mean something. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jerry. You know, when you hear how much time he did, you realize that he speaks with a great authority about what's going on inside the prison system. And now we want to talk a little bit about the focus on the issue that we have all been talking about over the last couple of years, especially, and that is the question of the brutality by the police of all of our young men and women, especially young men. So I would like to bring up a young brother who is going to talk a little bit about what we can do to stop and end police brutality, Brother Salih Muhammad.